as we've alluded to, and is of course no no mystery or no surprise to anyone, right, who's alive in 2020, families and individuals are under a lot of strain right now. They're working from home, they're teaching their children from home. Everything is kind of all in one place right now. And in fact, this pandemic has been referred to as a trauma. So would you agree with that?
It's interesting. I think there are definitely components of this experience of COVID-19 that could be understood as sort of what we call collective trauma, right? It's this collective experience of this event that has led to increased anxiety, hypervigilance, maybe low mood, right? Or mood changes. So I think in that regard, we can understand it as a collective trauma. As a therapist, I like to think of trauma as more about the response. So two individuals can experience the same event, the same thing, and have two fundamentally very different experiences. So while the event itself might be objectively considered something we would call traumatic, like an experience of abuse, for example, those two different individuals may respond very differently. One may end up and walk away with really chronic and severe PTSD and may need really intensive treatment to address those symptoms, while the other one might have some mild mood disturbance, a little bit of anxiety, a few counseling sessions to talk about what they experienced, and they're doing okay, right? So we have to remember that trauma is a response, right? It happens in our nervous systems. It's that fight or flight experience that we have. Yeah. And so I think we have to remember that people are probably experiencing COVID in many different ways.
Yeah.
We also know that the way it's affecting families varies greatly, right? So one family, they've lost their income, they've lost a loved one. That experience is very different from a family who hasn't lost their income. They may have the added stress of working from home and no childcare, but that's a different stressor, right? So we have to consider those differences. What I think is more pertinent to talk about is grief. I think that there has been a collective experience of grief through this whole pandemic experience, and that has manifested in different ways. So we've got the kind of clear-cut grief that we expect when we lose a loved one. So people who are losing loved ones and can't visit them in the hospital, I mean, heartbreaking. Yeah. Can't say goodbye, right? There's no funeral, there's none of the closure that we get from those rituals, right, that we engage in. So that's kind of clear-cut grief. But then we've also got these other little griefs, if you will. The grief of the loss of your normal routine, the grief of the freedom to run to the store without thinking twice about, do I really need to go to the store today? How many times did I go to the grocery store this week? Yeah. Do I want to put on a mask? The grief of graduations and weddings being postponed, birth experiences not being what they hoped it would be. There's so much that people are losing through this process. And grief has many stages. That's a whole other presentation. We could talk about that for a long time. So I won't go into the stages, but just know that it's not linear and it's all normal, right? Grief is a normal response to loss.
Yeah. So don't panic.
Right.
You're doing what you can in this very difficult moment.
Exactly.
So along those lines, when experiencing, I won't use the word trauma, but when experiencing grief during this crisis, how should individuals and families cope? What are some of the kind of top coping skills for both families and individuals? What can they use and kind of turn to right now?
So trauma and grief, I'd say both of them, because this could be experienced differently by different people, are, best dealt with. Again, we want to go back to the basics. So how can I take care of myself? If we're not taking care of ourselves, our baseline level of anxiety is going to be higher. So we're not sleeping, we're not eating well, we're drowning our sorrows in sugar and alcohol, which are like the two worst things for mood that you could possibly consume. Then our baseline anxiety goes up, right? Now we have a stressor that comes in, like COVID or a work stressful situation or a family stressor. And now we're already up here. So where is there to go? Only higher, right? So anxiety is now spiking even higher. If we can keep that baseline anxiety that we live with low, if we can kind of take care of ourselves, make sure we're prioritizing the things we need to feel healthy and good. Then when we have these stressors, we're going to get a spike in anxiety. We're going to struggle. That's normal. But it might not, we're not going to get quite as high, right? The peak doesn't go quite as high when that baseline is managed. So that's kind of one thought that I have for that.
Yeah.
Setting healthy boundaries around media consumption, I think, is huge. I think it was more pertinent in those very first weeks. Right. I'll never forget those first weeks of the pandemic, and it was just consuming. And every time you picked up your phone, there was a new notification, and you felt like you had to read it, because what if the world's falling apart and I don't know?
Yeah.
So this compulsion to continuously check news outlets and read and consume media. So healthy boundaries around that, I think, are really important. Knowing that the news will still be there. You know, you don't have to read it while you're eating dinner or while you're playing with your kid.
Yeah.
Put it aside. And then staying connected to people. So we are so blessed that this happened in 2020 and not 1995, when what would we have, I mean, truly, what would we have done? We would have been truly isolated. We have the ability, even though it's exhausting and it's not the same, but we have the ability to connect with people and to stay connected via technology. And so staying connected is very important as well.
Yeah. So can you talk about the long-term effects on someone's mental health of the social distancing and isolation? I mean, as you say, we are much more connected now than ever via our devices and technology, which is great. But fundamentally, we are still largely being asked to stay away from people. Maybe it's only 6 feet, maybe you're in person, but what are the kind of long-term effects on someone's mental health for all this?
I think that will depend. I think for some people, it won't be anything. I think for other people who have developed or who have already suffered from anxieties related to social interactions or health-related anxieties, that this lack of exposure to those things that make them anxious could really increase their anxiety quite a bit. So that, I think, is definitely a potential impact. As far as kind of on the general population, I think it's important to remember that we as human beings are incredibly resilient. I really think we're going to be okay. I really think that, you know, there'll be some things that shift and things that won't be the same in our lives. Things that we would have never even thought about before, that have now, you know, are unrecognizable in just the way we handle things. But I think from an emotional or a social emotional perspective, the human race has been through so much. If we look at history, and time and again, right, we come through it, and we persevere, and we continue to progress and grow, and, you know, things, technology continues to increase, and industry, and wind. I think that our story is one of perseverance and overcoming as a human race. And so I think we have to remember that. And then the other piece is that our faith, right, just tells us, like, we know who wins in the end. Like, this is not going to be the end of us. If, you know, there will be tragic loss of life, as we know has been the case in other illnesses, pandemics, plagues in the past. But that's not the end for those people either, right? So if we can keep our eye on that, it puts it into perspective.
Yeah, I just love that. I feel like that's a message that is often lost in the wider consumption of media, as you were saying. Like, you know, there's so much coming into our phones and being pinged at us all the time, and it's often the most, you know, it's the most immediate news. So it's like the most often kind of dismal news. I mean, in a lot of ways. So it can be hard to keep in mind, like, as I love that, like, we as a society and as human beings are resilient. You know, we are blessed by a creator who built us this way to be resilient, to be able to, you know, always be looking ahead to our eternal future and to the hope in that. I love that. I think that's so important to bear in mind for all of us.
Absolutely.
But what steps should an individual take to lessen any negative impact of, like, the isolation and social distancing aspects of this? What can they do?
So again, stay connected to the people that you love. As exhausting as Zoom, everyone was all about the Zoom happy hours initially. It was like so cool. We're having Zoom happy hours. We actually did a Easter dinner over Zoom with my family in New York, which was really cool. I come from a really loud Italian family though. And so, everyone was talking at the same time. It was it's a little overwhelming. But thanks be to God, right? That is even an opportunity. So continue to use the things that we have, the tools that we have. I also have just been so encouraged by just going up for a walk in my neighborhood and talking to people. This is sad to say, but we don't really talk to our neighbors very often anymore. Yeah. Our lives are so busy. And so you can stay connected in those other ways. I saw people that stopped to talk to some of the elderly people from their door, right? And they're standing on the sidewalk, but they're just checking in, making sure they're okay. Yeah. I think those simple things can go a long way to stay connected and to still feel like you're part of the human race, right? You're not in this alone in your house.
Right. That's beautiful. I love that. Yeah, I've seen the same thing in my neighborhood. We have a couple of kind of elderly neighbors, up and down the block. And I've just loved to be sitting out on my own porch or something and watching people visiting from, the appropriate distances, but it's just really sweet. Or like even from across the street, kind of shouting at each other, but
yes,
very absolutely. Like positive, helpful way, which is really beautiful.
Definitely.
So to shift a little bit, we wanted to talk a little bit about mindfulness and this idea of mindfulness. It's a popular practice in mental health these days. Can you speak about mindfulness from a Catholic perspective, and how do individuals put this into practice?
Mm-hmm. This is a very big topic. Yeah. So I will try to do it the most justice I can in as short amount of time as I can. Sure. So we have to remember mindfulness originated in Eastern philosophies, Buddhism specifically. And just like yoga, right? Some of these other things that have become very popular in the Western world in recent years. And it's funny, I would think that most true Buddhists would think that what we call mindfulness is actually like a bastardization of the actual thing. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that we might be talking about two different things in many ways. So if we look at mindfulness from a Buddhist perspective, where it originated, the purpose of mindfulness meditation in Buddhism is this realization of emptiness and to achieve complete detachment, right? To be liberated from all attachments and therefore reach nirvana, which is peace, right? Ultimate peace, happiness, the Buddhist version of heaven on earth, right? And their whole theory or their idea behind this philosophy is that it's through emptiness and liberation from attachments that we achieve peace and happiness and fulfillment. And I guess that's a bit of a oxymoron, not fulfillment per se, but that is the road to peace, right? And so they use mindfulness meditation as a path to get there. Oftentimes what we're talking about when we talk about mindfulness in a therapeutic standpoint is a mental state that's achieved by focusing on awareness of our bodies, of our emotions, of what's going on in our mind, of our sensations. So oftentimes mindfulness used in therapy involves focusing on our five senses. What can I hear? What can I feel? What can I see? Drinking a cup of tea mindfully means just drinking the tea, right? Just doing that one thing. Going for a mindful walk in therapy, or if it were recommended in therapy, would be going for a walk around your neighborhood and resisting the urge to ruminate and worry about that thing that you've been worrying about, and just noticing the trees and the birds and God's creation around you. From a Catholic perspective, we can also bring into being aware, ever in the moment, being ever aware in the moment of God's presence with us, right? And we can be mindful of that, right? It's just awareness. I have seen people really benefit from using some of these strategies when they're highly anxious and their brain is on overdrive. They're unable to stop thinking about something, obsessing about something, to bring them back into their body, right? As Catholics, we see ourselves as mind, body, and spirit, right? And we're integrated, ideally, right? we're not just a brain with a body attached to it, right? Yeah. We're not just a spirit. God put our spirits in our bodies and gave us intellect, right?
Yeah.
But the goal is integration as Catholics. And if somebody's anxiety disorder is keeping them so stuck in their head that they're not actually in their life, they're not actually to be able to be present in relationships. They can't pray because they can't stop worrying. Yeah. Some of these little strategies of just teaching someone to be aware of what they're experiencing in the moment can be so, so helpful. Yeah. Bottom line is, if we think about the sort of the purpose of it, Buddhism says that the goal of mindfulness is to empty ourselves out for emptiness' sake, right? The goal is emptiness.
Right.
When we use mindfulness in a therapeutic setting, but specifically in a Catholic kind of context, the goal is to empty ourselves out of attachments that are disordered and unhealthy, with the end goal of filling up with Christ, right? With the end goal of being constantly aware of God's presence in our lives. Yeah. So that's how I kind of approach it. I think there's a lot of different opinions on that. It really has been shown in research to be very helpful. Neuroscience research and MRI studies, functional MRI studies of the brain show brain changes in people who are using awareness kinds of techniques. So I think I don't think we want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I also think we want to be careful about how we're implementing it and what's on the other side of it, right?
Yeah.
So what's the goal?
Yeah, that makes total sense. Particularly from the Catholic perspective, as you say, like we are, in a sense, trying to empty ourselves, but not so that we're just empty, not for the goal of just being empty, for the goal of letting Christ in and letting God in completely. Mm-hmm. So along those lines, like what are the mental health benefits of prayer and meditation? Yeah.
So as I mentioned, there's just the way that we see the brain change and the way that neurons fire in response to meditation. So that parts of the brain that are kind of hyperactive when somebody is ruminating or anxious tend to kind of calm down with prayer and meditation. We know that anxiety and depression symptoms tend to decrease after periods of meditation and extended prayer from the research. We also know that it can increase the production of serotonin, which is amazing. So serotonin, which is the neurotransmitter. I'm sorry, can you hear me okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
So serotonin, which is the neurotransmitter responsible for our feelings of well-being, and that is the one that is actually being impacted by medications like SSRIs in people who have depression and anxiety, can actually be increased just from prayer and meditation. So that's pretty cool. There's also some newer research about attachment. So the experience of prayer largely depends on somebody's perceptions of God. This is really fascinating. Attachment style develops in our earliest years of life from our relationships with our primary caregivers. And so if we have an experience with primary caregivers being one that is distant or that this caregiver is overly punitive or waiting for us to mess up and punish us, then oftentimes we end up projecting some of those experiences onto God, right? We perceive God to be similar to the parent that wasn't what we needed them to be.
Right.
And so if somebody goes into prayer with this kind of disordered attachment, right, or this template that generally relationships are not healthy, God's not going to be there for me. He's waiting for me to mess up and he's just waiting to catch me in a mistake. That prayer could actually be pretty anxiety provoking.
Sure.
And so if people are having that experience, we work on that in therapy, right? We try to work on the actual attachment style that was created from those early experiences, try to have a different experience in the therapeutic relationship. But also, spiritual direction might be really healthy and helpful in that context for someone to kind of reorient or reset their understanding of who God is.
Yeah, almost like be reintroduced to God in a sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So that prayer then can be an experience that is calming and peaceful and fulfilling instead of frightening or anxiety provoking.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Great. So just a couple of more questions. Are there any individuals that you are especially concerned about kind of during this time, this
Mhm.
2020 crazy season? And how can we help those people?
Yeah, I would say the most isolated of everyone, as we all know, are going to be the elderly who maybe don't know how to use technology or have no interest in using technology.
Sure.
And people are staying away from them for good reason because they
Right.
don't want to get them sick.
Yeah.
So I think just from a mood perspective, I worry about people who are elderly and perhaps live alone and are really, really on their own through this process.
Yeah.
Um, as far as how we can help them, I'd say, is just to continue to reach out. So,
Yeah.
especially our parishes, right? This is a great time to be reaching out to the elderly because, you know, the people who are faithfully in the pews for many, many years, and now they've lost even that kind of community involvement. So I think if we can reach out and be connected, even just over the phone or sending notes or cards in the mail, I think that's just a way of helping them remember, like, we're still here, we
Yeah.
still love you,
I'm thinking. Yeah.
you're not alone, even though it feels like you are.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
The only other group that I really am concerned about is women and children that are in abusive settings of any kind. We know domestic violence has been on the rise since this has started. Tension is high, and abusers and victims are stuck in their homes together.
Yeah.
So that is very concerning. And children who are victims of abuse, who would normally um, be taken care of because teachers would be reporting to Child Protective Services
Yep.
and appropriate authorities would be getting involved. Those kids have been now in their homes for months with no outside involvement to really see what's happening in their homes.
Yeah.
As far as what we can do about that, I think for women, we can support with safe house recommendations
Right.
and support to resources for domestic violence. Um, Children, it's so hard because we don't know.
I know. Oh, yeah.
So I think the sooner we can just get society back to functioning, the
Right.
better. And by no means is the system perfect, but at the very least, something's happening. It's being reported. It's being addressed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's definitely a multi-level tragedy, this whole thing. There's just so much to it. So
much.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are some resources that are available for people to seek out if they need help, whether it's as an individual, like I think I need help, or a loved one that you want to help refer to someone? What resources are out there? What do we do?
Absolutely. So St. Raphael Counseling, I'll plug our practice.
Please.
We have offices all over the metro area. We've got one in Littleton, we've got one in Denver, we've got one in Englewood, we've got some up north. There's some in parishes as well. So really, there's an office for everybody. Most likely you'd be starting telehealth right now. So we're still doing all of our sessions online, which is not as awkward as it sounds.
We're
It's
all
not
getting more used
ideal.
to it. Yeah.
It's not ideal, but it does the trick. It's certainly better than nothing.
Yeah.
And so you can go to our website, straphaelcounseling.com, which is just ST Raphael Counseling, all one word. Or you can call our main number at 720-377-1359. Our website also has an appointment request form, so you can just
Great.
fill that out there if you prefer to do that.
Yeah.
And we do have therapists that are accepting clients
Wonderful.
during this whole pandemic. So
Great.
the other thing for more imminent support is there is a Colorado crisis hotline that I would just say is a good thing for people generally to know about. That number is 1-844-493-8255. And you can also text TALK, TALK, to the number 38255. That can be particularly helpful for adolescents if they don't feel comfortable calling or talking and they prefer to text.
Sure.
So those are some starting points.
Those are great. Yeah, and we'll be sure to link that all when we release all
That would
this.
be great.
So thank you. Yeah, that's all really helpful. And I was going to ask, like, is St. Raphael accepting people right now? What would that look like? So you answered
We
all.
are.
Great.
Yes, we are.
Well, and of course, we're all getting more comfortable with video conversations as we're doing now. So
That's right.
that is good. All right. Well, finally, Elizabeth, and thank you just so much for all the time you've given us and perspective. But finally, we just wanted to ask you, how has God surprised you during the pandemic? have there been unexpected fruits or graces that have come to you during this time?
Absolutely. I think generally just I'm sorry, there's a very loud lawnmower.
It's okay.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Generally just the increased simplicity in our daily lives. I think that has been a tremendous gift. I was really getting this sense in the months leading up to COVID beginning, both in my clients' lives and in my own life, of just this hectic, kind of intensely dizzying state of busyness that felt like, just from one thing to the next thing with no real pause, no real moments to just kind of appreciate the gift of life, appreciate that we're alive in this moment and that God is with us. And so for myself, and again, I say this with all understanding that not everybody's experience of this pandemic has been the same. I've been working from home with a toddler without childcare, so that's been interesting.
Yeah.
But I've also been able to go on long walks with her and, be next to her as she discovers like crickets and caterpillars for the first time. And she's growing before my eyes. And these are things that I was so busy that I was just getting through the day.
Yep.
And I didn't have really the ability to be present for. So I feel like our busyness, we've really started as a culture to worship productivity in many ways, right? It's like you have to do more, you have to have a side hustle. And if you're not doing more, then, you need to do more. Basically, this challenge, this constant challenge to do more. The pandemic even started with that, right? When it started, it was like, if you're not learning a new language or cleaning out 17 closets, then you're doing the pandemic wrong. And I'm like, oh gosh, I guess and I'm like, no, wait, no, this is not right. There's a gift here. And so I think just slowing things down a bit and going back to really what is essential, right? That word essential has been talked about so much. It's really put that in perspective, and it's in our circumstances, it's in our reality that God gives us what we need to grow in holiness, right? That's the opportunity that he's giving us here. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Doesn't mean there's not going to be difficulties within it. But when we're so busy that we can't even see our opportunities for growth amidst our days, that's a problem. So my hope is that for the whole world, that we will kind of go back to life somewhat more closely to normal than as it was, but that we're not going to go back to the worship of busyness and productivity that comes at the expense of relationship and presence.
Yes, I think that's a beautiful wish. And I certainly share it. I hope for the same. So again, Elizabeth, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot to just sit with for a little bit. So I thank you for your time and your willingness to join us today. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you everyone who watches this. We'll be sure to link to the resources that Elizabeth mentioned during this talk. And we look forward to seeing you next time. All right. Thanks.